Hello and welcome to Catholic Unscripted. I'm Katherine Bennett.
I'm Gavin Ashenden.
And joining us today is Sebastian Morello, our friend Sebastian, who is editor at the European Conservative, author, student under Roger Scruton, if I'm right. Is that right? You studied under Roger
that's right.
Scruton.
Yeah.
And father, husband, Catholic, and has recently returned from South Africa, where you went to give a different perspective to the one many of us will be presented with. And I've invited you onto the show to talk about the historical and moral connection between Catholicism and hunting. And I just want to read, because I think this is very amusing, and I'll share it here for people to have a look at, your write-up of your recent visit, where you begin, early the following morning we set off. At this stage, I do not know that I have before me an 11-hour hike across piercing ironstone with a rifle on my back. On departing, I'm underslept and tired. Within a few minutes, we approach an electric cattle fence on the outskirts of the farmstead. Believing it to be turned off, I climb over the wire, promptly electrocuting my groin. I now feel fully awake. Well, fully awake. I know you'll be back, and you've just said at the introduction that you'll be going back to South Africa this time, perhaps with a bit more training for what's required. So, tell us about your trip. What took you over there?
Well, I used to live in South Africa. I can tell you, an electric fence.
That's all I can think of. Is a trip over the electric fence.
No, I mean
one leg followed by another.
It was pretty shocking. No pun intended. It was it works better than coffee. An electric fence to the family jewels really does the trick. But the essentially, I used to live in South Africa. I have a great affection for the country. Some of my happiest childhood or teenagerhood memories are wrapped up with that country and its wildlife. We spent a huge amount of time in the Kruger National Park when we were out there, and also down at Knysna, the Phantom Forest, as it's called, which is a remarkable place, and apparently has come back marvelously after the terrible fires they had there a few years ago. And it's very typical for those of a conservative persuasion to talk about South Africa as nothing but a disaster, where there are farm attacks and the Afrikaner community there is under constant persecution, and that since at least the time of Mandela, it has waned and ebbed and is on the brink of a kind of institutional collapse. And a lot of that is true. But it's also not the only story to tell about South Africa. And there are really wonderful people out there doing really extraordinary things. And the political situation, I think, is vastly improving. At the level of civil society, there's the most astonishing cohesion and people working very closely together. People of different ethnic groups, the so-called Cape Coloreds, the Xhosa, the Zulu, the Afrikaner community, the descendants of English settlers. All of these people are now working together for the building up of the nation in a way that historically they haven't. And also, because of my love of hunting and field sports, and that's not just a hobby for me, there's something much deeper going on, which, if you like, we can talk about. I've been very interested in the case of South Africa because perhaps there more than anywhere, the connection between hunting and conservation, or if you want from a Catholic perspective, of stewardship, of care for the world that God has entrusted to us, the connection is perhaps deeper there than anywhere else, to the point that the hunting industry has brought back animals from near extinction that have been almost completely wiped out everywhere else on the continent. Perhaps the most important example is the white rhino, which nearly completely disappeared. And it's quite interesting because, for example, in neighbouring countries like Botswana, where hunting was never completely outlawed, but it was heavily, heavily restricted, and there was a huge amount of government interference in it. They realised that the degree to which they didn't allow human beings to participate in the life of the wildlife, particularly through hunting, these animals were getting lost. And so Botswana has moved to a model much closer to that of South Africa. Whereas you have a country like Kenya that outlawed hunting completely in 1977. And since then, they think now it's nearly an 80% reduction in the wildlife in that country since that time. And of course, why wouldn't there be? It's just obvious. If you are a country that is seeking to undergo, if you like, its own industrial revolution, which will mean industrializing not just the towns but the landscapes, because you want to feed your population, it's not obvious why you wouldn't turn all of this land over to agricultural industry. And the thing that people need to understand, I think, is that you don't preserve animals by preserving the creatures. Okay, because creatures preserve themselves, right? That's what procreation's all about. You don't preserve animals by preserving the creatures themselves. You preserve animals by preserving their habitats on which they depend. Everything is about habitat protection, and it's not just Africa. All through Europe, in this country, the foremost habitat conservers and protectors have been those who hunt and shoot. And I understand that a lot of people don't understand this, and also it's a topic that's emotionally fraught. But I think this topic, perhaps more than any other, from the perspective of stewardship, is one where we have to develop a disposition of disinterestedness and try to be a little bit dispassionate in our approach and try to understand what has actually worked over the centuries in order to preserve these creatures. So that's probably more of an answer than you were hoping for, but. If you don't interrupt, I'll just keep rambling. You see,
no, keep going. It's never more of an answer. It's absolutely crucial because, as you say, I think one of the great problems of our time, and the church isn't offering an adequate answer to it, is our role as stewards of creation, and it is. You've said yourself, we oscillate between two errors, and it's this lopsidedness in our thinking about what this means, about our proper place in the hierarchy of creation. And you said there that you have a love of hunting, and you spoke a little bit there about the importance of it, this right ordering, and said a lot of people don't understand this. So this is why I think it's so important to have you on today and to explain that, because many people will say, look, it's just cruel. These are God's creatures. You shouldn't hurt them. It's unkind. And what you've also demonstrated in the work you've done and written about and recorded, so people will be able to go and read and watch this, is that the same thing that devastated the sort of plains in Africa is what's now healing it. So instead of just chucking out the idea of hunting altogether, to distinguish unethical hunting from ethical hunting, and you've used this analogy, it's a bit, you say yourself this is quite coarse, but actually true. To condemn ethical hunting because of the evils of market hunting is like condemning lovemaking because of the evils of rapists. Can you tease that out a bit, what you mean by that, and try and show people what they've got wrong when they say hunting is evil, wrong, and we shouldn't support it at all?
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely forms of hunting that I condemn. And 19th century market hunting is a very good example, where essentially the demand across the world was for vast amounts of hides and ivory, and hunters would go in and they might kill 100 elephants in a day, for example, and essentially for the sake of profit. And there's an example where the natural endeavour of hunting, which is natural to our species, so long as our species has existed, we've hunted, gets completely detached from the moral relation that we have to the world that God has entrusted to us. And when that happens, it is a disaster. But actually, any great human achievement is like this. There are forms of farming that I condemn. I don't condemn farming per se, but there are forms of farming which are, which use caged battery animals that basically survive exclusively on vast amounts of antibiotics. I mean, that is not a healthy or decent way to farm. There are ways of building cities that I condemn, but I don't condemn the urban enterprise of human beings and the way that they congregate in towns and cityscapes. You can do this with anything, because the fact is, whenever you're dealing with human beings, you're dealing with something chaotic and struggling under the consequences of sin, essentially, to put it bluntly. And so that's why I say, instead of just immediately having an emotional response to something like hunting, it's much better to try and enter into a much more complex moral questioning relation with this activity, in the hope of seeing hunting as something that's truly expressive of our nobility as a species. I think it's a really remarkable thing that among all the predators of the world, we are the only predator who can develop a moral relation with our quarry. I think that's actually very important. And when I speak to fellow hunters and fellow deer stalkers, that's how they instinctively or intuitively think about the animals that they pursue. Deer stalkers, in particular, take very, very seriously the thought that they might injure an animal, for example. A lion that attacks a gazelle and sort of tears half of its side off or whatever, but then gets kicked in the face and the gazelle gets away. The lion might be unhappy that it's lost a meal, but it's not going to be up that night worrying that it's injured a creature that's got away. Only human beings are able to develop this moral relation with their creatures. And one of the things that worries me about the attack on hunting in our kind of late modern civilization is that we've so detached the consumption of meat from our natural activity as predators, that moral relation has broken down, and somebody can sit in a KFC and eat a load of fried battery chickens without remotely feeling implicated in the suffering of that creature. In fact, a modern person will be very happy to sit and eat a battery chicken whilst condemning hunting, for example.
Yeah, we've met many of those, haven't we?
Right. And this to me is not an indication of moral maturity. No. So this is why I think actually engaging with this topic in a thoughtful way is quite important for us. There's something much bigger at stake, is my point, I suppose. Again, no pun intended.
No, but let's get into what that bigger thing at stake is, because we started with your quote there about lovemaking, and all of these things have been perverted. You're using hunting there as an example, but in all ways we see how something that is the givenness of something, the givenness of creation, the right order, when that breaks down, then we see the rottenness and the bad fruits and the death. Because I think, you talked about the destruction with this market hunting. What this kind of paradox, which is that the pattern of reality, the immutable pattern of reality, is self-sacrifice. It is in the Trinity. It's Trinitarian. It's the Father who gives all to the Son. The Son doesn't grasp, who receives from the Father, and from that is begotten the Holy Spirit. that love that's ever eternal between them. And I think that as we move away from a proper understanding of God, then everything starts to crumble, and our approach is incoherent, such that you can be sitting in KFC munching on a chicken from a battery farm or something, and be complaining about the ills of hunting. We're so far removed from reality. So we said, let's get into the bigger picture. Gavin, I want to bring you in as well. I know you've been reading some of Sebastian's work, but you were commenting on his recognition through the things that he's writing about how important this sacramental understanding of reality is. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
I think two things that I've got from what Sebastian's been saying that I'd like him to expand on. And the first is this notion of a colonialist view of hunting by the city dweller. So liberal progressive political mind looks at hunters and sees them effectively as agents of a kind of anthropic colonialism, just exercising power improperly. But they're not very good with death, and they see blood and killing, and so they say this isn't very nice, it must be immoral. What Sebastian's asking us to do is to develop a greater facility with asking moral questions. And I think, so for the Church and for Catholics, one of the things, our first response is to say, let's try and find a way of having a moral conversation about this, because from the hunter's point of view, from the issues that Sebastian's put forward, there's a reciprocity between the hunter. I love this idea that human beings are the only predators capable of developing a moral relationship with their prey. And there's this sense of reciprocity, as you say, creatures will look after themselves. And if one then takes that to look at the next issue, I'd like Sebastian to talk about it more, which is our relationship with the environment, not as environment per se, but as the material. Because one of the things Sebastian's been writing about is the way in which there's a hatred of matter in our technological quasi-Gnostic society, which lives in its head and in its desiccated imagination, and has lost touch with what Katherine and I would call a sacramental view of reality. So there are two big questions here. One is to do with power and responsibility, and the other is to do with matter and spirit. And it seems to me that hunting is a very good way of beginning to raise a conversation in which we can have a more developed moral pursuit framed by the Catholic Church's point of reference. And at some point, I'm hoping that Sebastian will talk about the Church's epistemic failure. but maybe by having,
you're really looking forward to that bit, aren't you, Gavin?
Well, at some point we need to make the Church accountable for not doing exactly what Sebastian said. Sebastian's saying there hasn't been a moral conversation. Who better than the Catholic Church to facilitate a moral conversation? If it hasn't happened, then we need to be part of making it happen.
Yeah.
Okay, there's an awful lot there. So let me just, as my American friends would say, unpack it a little bit. Okay, let's talk first about this challenging relationship between the landscape and the townscape, or the landscape and the cityscape, and the way in which, as we have become a people increasingly detached from the landscape, ways of managing the landscape have become more and more incomprehensible to us. And that is definitely a very big problem. It's not by accident that under the government of Tony Blair, hunting with hounds was outlawed, because there was a huge project under Tony Blair to turn the people who still had some connection with settled places and localities and even the countryside into a kind of bourgeois class, all of whom had a tertiary education, all of whom could go and be objects of use in any place according to the demands of the market. that transformation has largely been quite successful. I use the word transformation rather than development, because I think development entails something positive, and I think it's actually been hugely undermining that whole trajectory of the English way of life. But one of the great tragedies about the Hunting with Hounds Act 20 years ago is that it had absolutely nothing to do with questions of stewardship or conservation. And the consequences have been disastrous for the quarry animals, by the way. Throughout most of the country, the habitats of the foxes were protected by the hunts who wanted to hunt them through the season. Hounds are always slower than their quarry. That's why beagles and bassets have always been used for hares and foxhounds, and never staghounds for foxes, largely because the healthy ones get away. So you were actually protecting the quarry species from their own members who might cause infectious diseases and all sorts of things. Those foxes that were sick and therefore couldn't hunt for themselves were much more likely to risk the danger of going onto farms and trying to get into chicken coops and so on. So you're also eliminating those that the farming community actually had a problem with. This is a system that was worked out over centuries. Once fox hunting was banned, you simultaneously took away from the rural community any incentive to protect those animals. And so people just started managing their numbers with firearms, shooting them with rifles, which of course there's no closed season for that, like there was with hounds, which meant that pregnant foxes are routinely shot, and even worse, milky vixens are routinely shot, which means then the cubs starve to death in the dens. So now it's open season with firearms all year round on foxes and hares. And in fact, I think now, for the first time, the urban fox outnumbers the rural fox because they've just been wiped out. All of this is a consequence of taking away the incentive to protect the quarry species and to protect the habitats of those quarries. When you go across the English countryside, what you see is the fields following the contours of the land, and they're punctuated all over the place with covers and spinneys and little woodlands. There is absolutely no reason for the farmers to maintain the spinneys and the copses and the covers and the woodlands and all of these things that make the English countryside so majestic, because that just takes away from the farmer land that he could convert over to arable industry or for grazing. So there's no reason to have these unless you're putting them there as habitats for wild animals, which is what they've always been. And they've always been because there's been a whole culture of incentivizing doing that. Those incentives were all taken away 20 years ago, and the consequences have been disastrous. And of course, all of those spinneys and woodlands are rapidly disappearing. In the last 80 years, we have lost 50% of our forest and our woodland in this country, and that has hugely escalated and intensified in the last 20 years. And for the reasons I've given, there's much to suggest that the relationship of that with hunting is one of causation rather than correlation. So there is one of the problems that we have, if you want to bring this back to the notion of what does the Catholic Church have to say about this, well, here's a very good example of the principle of subsidiarity completely going out of the window. I mean, if the Labour Party 20 years ago had the sufficient humility to think that perhaps Westminster was not best placed to regulate the activities of rural people, and that probably the best people to decide on the activities of rural people were the rural people themselves, that would have been a very interesting acknowledgement of the veracity of subsidiarity that would have actually prevented all of the kind of deleterious effects that we've seen in the countryside recently. So there's just one little example. In terms of
Can I just interrupt for a second and just
sure.
ask? A lot of what you're talking about is what you might term unintended consequences,
Hmm.
like the unintended consequences that would be around, that has been shown to be the case around the minimum wage, around rent control, around getting women into work. And we look at the damaging effects of those and say these are unintended consequences. And now taxation on farmers, inheritance tax, and
Yes.
oh, look at the unintended consequences. To what extent do you think these are unintended consequences, or do you think it's fair to say some of these might very well be intended consequences? And if so, why? To what end?
I think it's a risky game to try to work out too much, not only other people's hearts, but certainly the hearts of politicians. I think the jury's out on whether most politicians have hearts. But I would say that, as I said at the beginning, there was definitely a social transformation that the Labour Party 20 years ago wanted to bring about. If you like, the current Labour Party wants to bring about the next stage of that transformation. This stems from a certain late Enlightenment, post-scientific revolution conception of how you arrange human polities. And you arrange them by having an abstract schema of your ideals, and then you, with that technical knowledge, you go in and you conform the rest of society to your set of abstractions, irrespective of the really complex settlement that has come about over centuries, and all of the different negotiations and conversations, and even tacit conversations, unspoken conversations, customs, mores, that are so complex and so sophisticated, the origins of which largely have been lost for most of us, but they work, that they are completely outside the purview of the set of formulae or abstractions of ideologically driven people. And this is one of the huge problems that we have in modernity in general, that we have to spend our lives being constantly tormented by people who think that a set of abstract ideas that they've conceived of in their minds should replace the world in which they have found themselves.
Don't move the Chestertonian fence.
Yeah,
the Chestertonian fence, exactly. Yeah. So this is much more a problem of the modern mind, really.
A mind absent God, would you say?
Well, it's not any God, because we're not talking about. I'm not talking about Descartes' God here. The trouble is, I don't know if you've read some or come across or had a look at some of my books, like The World as God's Icon or whatever. But I'm essentially a Christian Neoplatonist in terms of my metaphysics, and so the God that I believe in is one that we assent to. Largely because we encounter him in creation. The whole of the world, in terms of its existence and its intelligibility, participates in the created act of God. And insofar as it does that, God is emanated in his creation, which means that the whole universe is God's iconography. It's an iconography of his own goodness and his own love. And so I very much, I take very, very seriously God as knowable insofar as he is grasped as providential, as he unfolds in his created order. And so the consequences of such a view or such a natural theology is that I don't see our encounter with God as ahistorical. This is one of the reasons why I'm suspicious of the way that Catholicism in particular is often conveyed to people today as purely a propositional exercise to which you then give intellectual assent and then, hey presto, you've got the faith, rather than an initiatory pathway in which you're inducted into the divine mysteries so that
you have to participate.
You participate and you live in kinship with him,
Yeah.
because he's the ground of being, and everything that exists, which quite clearly is contingent on non-contingent being. And so God is absolutely immediately present at all times. He is, as Augustine says, closer to me than I am to myself. And so
Can
once
I throw
you
something
Gavin, just to finish that thought, what that all entails. No, just because otherwise I'll lose it. By which I don't mean have a breakdown. I mean I'll lose the thought. What that all entails is that because our encounter with God is one that happens in history and in time, you have to take tradition in the broadest possible sense incredibly seriously, right? You are the recipient and beneficiary of something the accumulated experience of God emanated in his creation is something that you then receive. And so if you think that you can come along and just replace that with a kind of year zero account, whether it's of religion or whether it's of society or politics or anything, then already, as far as I'm concerned, you're someone who ought not to be trusted at all. And insofar as I see those kind of year zero experiments taking place in the church, and I think there's been a lot of that, I don't like it. So sorry, go ahead, Gavin. Sorry.
That's extremely important, and I'm sorry I nearly hijacked that. But what I wanted to say was partly to pick up Catherine's point, which is to perhaps we can distinguish between good and bad Catholicism. So it seems to me, first of all, that obviously I have an interest here. I've become a Catholic, and I'm keen. I think the two deficiencies you've talked about are effectively Protestant deficiencies. I'm not saying this in order to be tribal. I mean, in order to try and find the ideological root of where we've gone wrong. So you describe, for example, Catholicism behaving badly as a set of creedal ideas you have to give assent to rather than engaging in participation. But this creedal assent is an Enlightenment thing. It's essentially it's a Protestant cultural thing, which Catholicism has given way to, perhaps, but doesn't need to, partly because, and that brings us to the sacramental. The whole beauty of sacramentalism is precisely this fusion of matter and spirit, in which one, in a Neoplatonic way, consents and enters into. I didn't know you were a Neoplatonist, because I thought I was the only one left, and so it's even nicer to meet you. But this whole business of participation in the way in which God emanates through matter is preserved by the Catholic sacramental understanding of the Mass, which is the sort of the fusion point of this whole perception. So although you're quite right in saying that there's a form of Catholicism which has given way and hasn't dealt with this properly, it does seem to me that authentic Catholicism has at its heart exactly the remedial medicine for the ills you've outlined as they come at us, particularly through a dualistic form of material fixated urbanization and the residue of the Enlightenment Cartesian mind, detached from the body, just having thoughts, or as you described them in terms of labor policy, sort of strategic mental maps that get imposed on reality. So Neoplatonism, sacramentalism, rejection of Enlightenment ideas disembodied from human experience. These are things that this is precisely the Catholic agenda, isn't it?
Yeah, but it's at the root of all of it. Can I just leap in very quickly with John Ralston Saul's words from Voltaire's Bastards? He explores the interplay between religion and imagery and says, the death of God combined with the perfection of the image has brought us to a whole new state of expectation. The electronic image is man as God, and the ritual involved leads us not to a mysterious Holy Trinity, but back to ourselves. And then you spoke about the Eucharist, Gavin, and it's true, by participating in the Eucharist, believers embrace an alternative to the disconnect and idolatry of hyperreality. It calls for an authentic and transformative encounter with the reality that transcends the superficiality of our image-saturated world. Beholding the Lamb of God in the Eucharist is a transformative act of resistance against the illusions of hyperreality. It calls us to direct our gaze to the ultimate reality of God's presence and find
Very
strength
good.
in the depths of truth amidst the distractions of the image-saturated world. Because going back to you, Sebastian, and sorry to interrupt you, but a lot of the things that you write about and a lot of your work seems to ask us to look at how we are distracted from exactly what we've been discussing here, the givenness of nature, the givenness of things, that how we ignore tradition at our peril, and trying to imagine that we can start from year zero is not only wrong, but can be seen to be wrong. And people are hungry, they're malnourished, they need to know how to be fed. So part of the problem is, how have we got here? But another question is, what's the antidote?
So I'll pick up both points there, if I may, or do my best. I agree that this, what I've described, is not a problem with Catholicism per se. It's to do with, as I said earlier, the Catholic Church, I think, has conceded so much epistemological and metaphysical territory to modernity that largely, popularly, she has become alien to herself, right?
Absolutely.
And this is the fundamental problem, and therefore it's much easier and safer to think of Catholicism as simply a propositional religion. There are a set of maxims or formulae to which you assent, then you have it, and then and that's why, as I sometimes point out in my books, that's why Catholicism has successfully basically transitioned into an internet genre. It's no longer a mystery religion, which is what it was. It was a mystery religion baptized, and what it still is. But the trouble is that this conception of Catholicism as essentially rationalism with a religious veneer has dramatically affected our liturgical lives. And our liturgy at the moment is largely a kind of vernacularized didactic exercise, and therefore is something rationalistic. And I don't think this is going to really get solved until we retrieve our own liturgical inheritance. And once we have started to do that, then it will be a lot easier to talk about our religion as a liturgical religion, principally, before it is a... I'm not saying it's not a propositional religion. I think it's important to know truths about Catholicism and disbelieve untruths about Catholicism. I just don't think... look, I mean, my view of the revelation of Jesus Christ is essentially that it's just one big love affair. Okay, yeah. He's the bridegroom, we're the bride. This is a massive love affair, and the eschaton is the wedding feast of the Lamb. That's what I understand Revelation to be. So,
Part B: bring back the Latin Mass, and everything will flow from there. Brilliant.
Yes, I was trying to be a bit more subtle than that, but basically, yes.
But in some way, you're absolutely right, Gavin, because it most naturally conforms to who we are. You wrote an article for the Latin Mass Society talking about a guy in your choir who's a scientist, a scientific guy, who said he just couldn't comprehend why anyone would be interested in the Latin Mass, and said it's beyond him. And I've said that we're fundamentally sort of changed as a creature by this post-Enlightenment, like the rationalistic worldview that permeates everything. But we really are in there. Like, we're really still there. Our hearts are restless until they find rest in God. And it is through that traditional liturgy. And some people say, but I can't understand Latin. But that misses the point. It doesn't matter, because it's not about intelligibility.
Exactly.
Not everything has to be about intelligibility.
You've summed up my excitement. I mean, the reason I interjected in that tribal way, bring back the Latin Mass, was that Sebastian is doing such a job being delicate, sure-footed and delicate. But I wanted people to get the slogan at the end, because this this recovery of our liturgical tradition, in which you so delicately expressed it, essentially the way in which that cookie is crumbling is between the Novus Ordo and the Latin Mass at the moment. And so many people, a bit like fox hunting, what you've done is to say, beyond the presentation of nice against not nice, nice being the modernity, and not nice things people don't understand the Chestertonian fence was presented for. What you've done in both cases, both with fox hunting and the liturgy, is to say, here are the reasons why it's absolutely essential that you should keep the integrity of the developed experience of the divine within the community, one within the urban created community, the Latin Mass within the liturgical community.
I was talking with my daughter yesterday when we were doing a little bit on Aristotle's Four Causes. And once we'd gone through a few things, I said, could you mow your lawn with the air fryer? And she said, no. And we talked about why. And she said, because it wasn't designed for that. It wasn't built to mow your lawn with. And I said, what if you really wanted to? And she said, no, you still couldn't. Because we've lost a sense of the telos. What are we created for? And then how does our form, as male and female, or as human compared with animal, how does our form fit in with that telos? Sorry, I'm bringing all kinds of other things. But the point is, the Mass, our liturgy matters. How we worship matters, because it's more aligned. It's aligned completely with how we are created and what we've been created for. So it's no wonder that actually someone would say, why are you bringing in trans issues? But even all the stuff about trans issues, all the hunting stuff we've talked about, it all goes back to this idea of we've lost that telos in a desperate attempt at ecumenism, which goes back to your stuff about Protestantism, Gavin. We've also lost the liturgy that helps us to understand who we also are, so that we can better be aligned with our nature, at least recognise our nature, and then understand ourselves in the natural world.
Let's bring it back to hunting for a second, because I mean, liturgy and metaphysics, that's all very well, but let's get to the important stuff.
You said you were a Neoplatonist. Look at you zooming off you're into paganism. I feel betrayed. No, I know exactly where you're going. Go ahead. We're with you.
Okay. I mean, Katherine, in a way, if I may be so bold, your example of the air fryer and the lawnmower, you're sort of conceding a bit of territory yourself to the Enlightenment there, only because the pre-modern mind would not think that it was appropriate to use a mechanistic metaphor first, but to use an organic metaphor. That actually artifacts come second, but if you really want to know the telos of things, you need to think of the telos of a tree or a flower or something like that. And it's quite interesting, because in modernity, one of the things that we've done is we've conflated what questions with why questions. So when a child says, why is the sky blue? Right, we say, oh well, it's because refracted light most of the planet's covered in the ocean, and as it hits the ocean, the white light becomes blue, and we give this explanation. But actually, that's a what question, right? That, or rather, it's even a how question. How is this the case? Whereas a why, if you ask, why is the sky blue? Actually, the answer, why is the sky blue, is that God created a world in which he impregnated the things of his creative act within a meaning, and through our own wisdom traditions, we perceive that blue is the image of wisdom, and he's covered the whole world in this blanket to symbolize his wisdom. And suddenly you're asking the why is the sky blue? The Magna Mater, the Prima Natura, the absolute embodiment of the whole created order, that then gets assumed up into the eternal word and gives us the incarnation, and then the unification unification of heaven and earth is just the fulfillment of the incarnation at the end of time. So that's why the sky's blue. And so
and that's why we can repudiate Gaia too along the way, by as it happens.
Right, or at least redeem Gaia.
Redeem, better redeem. Quite right.
Why does this bring us back to hunting? What I want to say is that I do think that, at least my experience of hunting, is that it is one way by which the Christian mind can extend the sacramental genius into the created order. And it's really interesting that in Catholic countries, I mean, England is a special case in that we are a very especially spiritually frozen and asphyxiated people. So our hunting traditions have been almost completely stripped of their kind of ritualistic sort of accompaniments. But on the continent, there's a long tradition of saying prayers to St. Hubert and St. Eustace before hunting, of putting out the fallen quarry between flaming torches and singing songs of thanksgiving. There's deer stalkers on the continent will often, after shooting a deer, will walk up to it. And actually, funnily enough, I was walking with my son and our dog in a nearby field recently, and I came across two deer stalkers, and they had just shot a Chinese water deer. Chinese water deer escaped from the estate of the Russells, the Duke of the Bedfords.
This is the word I can't pronounce.
About 100 years ago. And
what's the real word? It's got a J and something else in it. Sorry. What's this real word?
You're not thinking of muntjac.
I am. That's it.
No. These are two different deer.
Okay, fine. The muntjac. Go on.
Gavin, the muntjac you couldn't say.
We were talking about the muntjac before you came on. So I'm interrupting again. Please go on.
No, not at all. So Chinese water deer are very strange creatures because they're these kind of big teddy bear, shaggy deer with long fangs. So it's sort of like a teddy bear and a vampire had a baby or something, and that's what they look like. And the thing is that they're almost extinct in China. So, but we have them everywhere in England. So people like to come to England because it's a completely unique experience to stalk them here. And they had just shot a Chinese water deer, and my son and I walked over to chat to them. And as I looked at the deer, there were some flowers that had been placed along the body of the deer, and the deer stalker had stuffed oak leaves in its mouth, right? And I started to talk to him, and then this thick Middle European accent came forth, and of course he was a European hunter, and that's why he had done this. He wanted to give the deer its last meal, which is what you do on the continent, and you then place flowers as an offering, a thanksgiving to the maker of the deer, to its creator, to its author, and so there is still half these people probably don't go to church, but these traditions have remained because there's this intuition that you're trespassing, you're entering into something extremely sacred, that this is God's creation, that he has brought these animals into being. He's held them in being because of love of them. They were conceived from all eternity so that they might give him glory. And by becoming a predator of these creatures, you are on thin ice, basically, and it would be very easy to offend your own creator in the way that you conduct yourself towards these animals and so forth. That's the kind of moral relation that I'm talking about once it's baptized and it's assumed up into a pious heart. And so that's why I sort of think about these things.
And there is, in terms of a frozen English spirituality, there is no music and very little dancing. My first clue that there's something stultifying about our natural links with the past was that whenever I was with European teenagers, they had songs to sing that emerged from their folk traditions, and they had dances. I mean, we have Morris dancing, which I'm not, I'm not qualified to speak about, but nothing else. No music, no dancing to take us back to the time before the fence was planted in the Chestertonian sense, and that's very this frozenness of English culture, which I imagine has got a great deal to do with the destruction of the monasteries and the abolition of the sacrament, which is another reason for a certain amount of rejuvenated Catholic enthusiasm.
I would dissent, I'm afraid, there, Gavin. I think that the English folk musical tradition is extremely rich,
but not accessible.
No,
it was rescued by the Sharps.
Well, but is it not accessible because of our reductionist modern worldview? Like, we see art, like the pinnacle of art is something like looking at a painting, whereas Morris dancing could be more arguably the high point of art because it's participatory. And so,
I mean, the interesting thing though about the folk tradition in England in terms of its music, by the way, a lot of those songs are about hunting. Interestingly enough, is that people like Shirley Collins and Martin Carthy and some of the really great figures who were trying to collect all of these folk songs in the 1950s. I mean, both of those figures are still alive. I think they're in their 90s. They saw that after World War II, there was this huge appetite for year zero thinking, and the towns and the cities were being bulldozed and replaced with these facetious glassy cubes, and our entire kind of inherited culture, it was like everyone had become so traumatized by the two wars that the thinking was, we've just got to start again. And they saw this rush of American pop culture coming into England, and they thought that all of our folk traditions, our kind of shared vernacular of aesthetics and music and so on, was just going to go in the space of 10 years. And actually they were dead right. And so they kind of did in the 20th century, or in the mid-20th century, what someone like Vaughan Williams had been doing in the early 20th century, of trying to collect as many of these really important shared folk songs and so on as they possibly could. And thank God they did, because they managed to get them all recorded and so on.
No, well, that's what I was talking about. I didn't explain it very well, but in the 1960s, in my tiny little school, we had singing from the Cecil Sharp folk book. I mean, we had a 45 minutes of accompanied singing of English folk songs. But what was extraordinary? Well, it was really wonderful, and it stayed with me forever. And another reason why I adore Vaughan Williams, of course. In a slightly more extended form, I would have said, I got a taste of the English folk musical tradition, which when I left my little school, and Mr. Henderson, who accompanied us singing Dashing Away with a Smoothing Stone, nobody else knew about. And right. So as I sat on coaches with English sports people, all they could sing was 10 Green Bottles. And yet, the French and the German, our French and German equivalent, had the whole equivalent of the Cecil Sharp thing accessible. I think I was the last generation to sing that stuff, at least. Well,
I'm very proud to tell you that all three of my children can sing "Dashing Away with a Smoothing Stone" from beginning to end.
Excellent. Well, I once again, I no longer feel lonely as I did as a Neoplatonist who's with access to British folk song. I mean, Katherine, thank you for bringing in Morris dancing, and maybe somebody can say something sensible.
Did I bring in Morris dancing? I can't remember.
No, you really did, and I just backed off because I know that whilst I can talk about English folk music, I can't talk about English dance. I don't understand Morris dancing.
I'm a huge enthusiast for Morris dancing.
Good.
I thought you might be good.
We should get together and do a Catholic unscripted.
It's really
Morris dance off.
It's fantastic, and the number of Morris dancing sides that are being founded at the moment. There's a huge revival going on throughout the country, but largely because there's something weird going on in England at the moment. There's a kind of a reawakening of Deep Albion right now, which I think
this is beginning to be quite interesting.
Yeah,
beginning.
well, Sorry
Sebastian.
to only start now. But
no, but there's another conversation. There's another conversation we might have, because one of the things I want.
We'll break it up into two parts.
One of the we probably haven't got time for this, but having read one of Sebastian's articles,
Sebastian just walked 11 hours in South Africa to shoot a deer, so he's got time. Haven't you?
Wildebeest, actually.
Just don't a wildebeest. Sorry. Yeah, sorry.
I'd love to hear more from Sebastian and less from me about the reawakening of Albion. But in the background, I wanted to ask questions about the metaphysical conception of the nature gods. You know, you talk about the Norse gods and the Greek gods, because it seemed to me you were right. I thought you were having too broad a stroke, because I thought there was something less puristically emanatory about the gods and something much more ambiguous in terms of the way in which they slip into the demonic. And so I'm not trying to demonize everything that automatically isn't Christian, but I just thought, wait a moment, it's precisely this this dividing line between the sanctification of nature and the worship, the improper worship of nature, which is where the demonic thing comes in, that I just wanted to see a dotted line in. But talk us about, to talk much more importantly, what's happening in Albion.
Well, I think that there is it always happens too late, unfortunately, but there is a sense going on at the moment that for all of its problems, England is something extremely special. It's the crossroads of the world, really, and for some reason, you know, we never had a French-style revolution. There, as Edmund Burke proved in the first quarter or first third of Reflections on the Revolution in France, even the 1688 revolution, you were able to give some kind of conservative spin on it. And in the end, we always kept the shadow, at least, of a settled medieval constitution with lords temporal and spiritual, with a sacral monarch. And even if it wasn't entirely the real thing, it was still it was treasured as a recognition that these things were not to be overthrown in one great chaotic, violent spasm, which happened across the continent. And still we toil under a flag covered in crosses rather than the tricolor or anything like that, like all the other European nations. In a way, we sort of had our revolution too early, and so our revolution was not sufficiently revolutionary to turn us all into absolute rationalist atheists. And so something, or at least the intimation of something really, really special has been captured because of our strange, unique history in these isles. And I get this sense that in England, and you can see it emerging in articles online, you can hear it being whispered in pubs over real ale, you know, you come across it all the time. There is this sense that something deeply meaningful and magical has happened here, and as Roger Scruton used to observe, whilst it might have taken a couple of thousand years to create, it would only take a moment to destroy it and to wipe it off the face of the planet. And maybe we've come to this realization too late, but I'm amazed by the number of indications I come across that there is this awakening that we can't just let it all disappear and vanish into obscurity. And I hope that's the case, because I really do think we have something very special here. A friend of mine, an important writer for Unheard, whom I shan't name, said to me recently that she was absolutely convinced that England would survive, but only under the stewardship of the traditional Catholics. And so, anyway.
So can I, in which case, that gives me an opportunity for saying something I would have been too shy to have said otherwise, which is this sense of intimation of medieval sanctity, which constitution and our monarchy contained, inspired me as an Anglican, and I was very proud of it, and saw essentially Anglicanism as a form of having a kind of guardianship of something it didn't understand and no one could articulate, but essentially had Catholic roots. And one of the things I have against Anglicans is that they overstate their stewardship and their responsibility of their Catholic roots, because there's a profound conflict at the heart of the way in which the establishment repudiated the essence of Catholicism while keeping the appearance. What you're saying, rightly, is that the appearance is worth a great deal, because it's not just a sign. There's something semiotically potent about it, but that semiotic potency is Catholic, and so I've moved to the point of saying it wasn't enough to be the guardian of signposts you couldn't read properly. The situation is now so serious that you have to actually take full responsibility for this representation of, well, I've forgotten the phrase you used, but it has sanctity at the heart of it, a form of sanctified, co-responsible, mutually engaged monarchical relationship in which God is at the apex of everything. And so it seems to me that since Protestantism has run out of ideas, even hybrid Protestantism, which Anglicanism has also run out of ideas, the only way, therefore, this semiotically potent residue can be re-energized would be by filling it with Catholic integrity. And then the question is, how on earth does that happen? Because the monarchy, Parliament has tied the monarchy into Protestantism with some hexes of a very serious kind. And let's say Prince Charles became a Catholic, or even, God bless him, William, they would have to abandon the throne in order to be a Catholic. I can't see any way in which the constitutional Protestant lock on the medieval semiotic inheritance can be picked without the whole thing blowing up. But perhaps there is a way, and maybe I assume you think there must be, or else you wouldn't see this residue of Catholic philosophical integrity as having continual meaning.
Well, I think the first thing to say is that actually there isn't a choice. When we gather around the Lamb at his wedding feast at the eschaton, we don't gather as insulated, isolated individuals who have said Jesus is my Lord and Saviour, and we have this kind of hot wire up to the Lamb of God, and that's it. That's not what the book of the Apocalypse says. It says that it's the nations that gather around the Lamb. We actually gather around him as corporate persons, not insulated persons. Yes, the ethnoi, the tribes, the peoples, and the nations, and also it's Matthew 28 verse 19 is not to go and make disciples of all individuals; it's to go and make disciples of the nations. So this is an absolutely key motif to understanding what the Church's mission is all about. It is the sacralization of the corporate persons of the nations that needs to take place. Now, what our Constitution still does is, albeit performatively and theatrically, it nonetheless intimates that something like a discipleship of the nation was its living reality at some point. And as Roman Catholics, we simply don't have a choice. We know that the eschaton demands the discipleship of the nations. And so we have to in some way reunite this corporate person with the Lamb again. And it seems to me that if we're not going to have a year zero approach to that apostolate, we have to take very, very seriously the degree to which that discipleship was woven into it at a cultural, social, and constitutional level. Now, who knows how that might unfold? Perhaps, we'll have enough MPs who are so indifferent to religion that they simply won't realise how serious it would be were the monarch to become a Catholic, and for the sake of egalitarianism and openness and diversity and inclusion, they get rid of the caveat, and then there's some great conversion, perhaps by Prince in the life of Prince George or something, and then suddenly the tables are turned. just as at the very time in the nation you have this huge awakening of a traditional Catholic movement, and you do in this country, unlike pretty much anywhere else on the planet.
Sounds very Narnia-esque, the last battle.
Well, who knows? I mean, I my brother is an MP, and it should be a consolation to you to know that he's a completely religiously indifferent atheist. So he might be just the person to drive through something like this. Who knows? I love my brother very much, but
Cyrus the Persian re-embodied.
Yeah, indeed. So I look, I'm not here to try and play the prophet. I'm simply saying that actually, it's very easy for us, largely because of the kind of rationalism that we were discussing earlier, to think of our religious commitments principally as something that takes place in the secluded cloisters of our own hearts, and it's between you and Christ, and that's simply not the Catholic view. The Catholic view is the discipleship of the corporate person of the nation, and so we don't have a choice. That's what we've got to work with.
Which is why, because everything is nested in a spiritual warfare and spiritual battle, which is why the idea of this globalist view that we destroy family, destroy nation, eradicate boundaries. You talked about, I know under Scruton, he talked about the anywheres and the somewheres, didn't he? You said under Blair this idea of, well, I don't know if it's that. You're Sebastian Morello, and you'll be able to give us much more detail on that. But I'm Katherine Bennett, and I'm saying the somewheres, the people who have place and community matters, and they live here, and it's their soil. And the anywheres, the laptop class who can travel here, live there, it doesn't matter. Home could be anywhere. So in looking at it from a spiritual point of view, of course, how would you undermine that by getting rid of boundaries, getting rid of nations, destroying cultural identity, national identity? And so, of course, we're talking about political answers, but it is ultimately spiritual, isn't it? And it's how we have to live it. We have to not just say this is the answer, but we have to live the answer. We have to be the answer. We have to participate, which is why there's some frustration around the cultural Christianity that we see, which is, Christianity is really good. It's able to hold the nation together, but looking from the outside and saying, look how useful it is in this kind of teleological way rather than participatory. And in defence of my lesson with my daughter, I agree with what you're saying, but to start from where we're at, which is to get young people, because I've worked a lot with young people in schools, and you have to see where they're at. Not everyone is sitting in pubs having this re-enchantment. They're really drawn into, I'd love it if they were, but we the thing is that isn't the case everywhere, and there are huge problems, and we have to pull them first of all away from the devices, away from the artificiality. And one way of doing that, I try to get them to say that artificiality has been designed for a purpose, and get them to see in the artificial world how everything has this kind of purpose to what end, and then say, well, wouldn't that pattern also follow in the natural world, that everything has some kind of purpose, that it's not just random lumps of material, that our existence itself tends towards this telos by the hand of our creator. So it's taking where they're at and saying, now let's move from that recognition that you don't just have blobs of stuff that pop into existence, that there's a mind behind it, to say, well, what about the mind of our existence? That's where I was trying to go, rather than saying we've got to, define everything in terms of the material.
Katherine, I think you took my tentative correction more seriously than I was advancing it. I have no doubt that you are exactly the teacher that your daughter needs. But I nonetheless, I would say that it's one of those interesting things that I find myself doing it all the time. That I will often privilege or prioritize mechanistic metaphors over organic or personalist metaphors, and that's what people tend to do.
Yeah. No,
and it's very interesting if you look at our Lord's teaching. He most never uses mechanistic metaphors. There's the house built on sand. I'm trying to think of another one, but it's nearly all birds of the air, lilies of the field, seeds sown in the ground. So I'm interested. I'm very interested in this topic of the degree to which, you know, aspects of modernity colonize our minds, and we concede that territory, and it enters our idiom, and so I'm always sort of wondering about it. But anyway, I shouldn't drag you into that.
This is why language is so important, and keeping a check on language, because, of course, language it is from our experience of the world, like the natural symbols. So we speak about the seeing, meaning understanding, and music as well. You don't say music that has a minor key is we say it's dark and depressing or sinister. It is that, and so we use those words then.
No,
so the words
Schubert
come
is the most hopeful.
From, but what my point is we're told now that we create language, we give meaning to language, rather than saying language becomes a way of expressing the meaning that we experience, and that's when we get into the craziness of gender ideology and things like that. Is because we say that we're the masters of language.
There's a great deal to be
it's
excited.
Givenness versus erecting ourselves as the giver and rejecting the giver.
There's a great deal to be excited about in this conversation. First of all, it had never occurred to me to avoid mechanistic metaphor before, but now I'm on high alert, and I'll do my very best.
We do it though.
And secondly, the Bennett aphorism, "Get thee to a pub and seek thou thy re-enchantment," seems to me to be, to sum up, the heart of the promise of whatever Albion is pregnant with. It's very exciting.
You could do a lot worse than drinking in your local pub. That's for sure.
Right. Yes.
Yeah, I think I'd like to spend more time drinking in a local pub, talking about re-enchantment. Living in South London, it's not so easy.
One doesn't have to distinguish between forms of re-enchantment. However, drinking in the pub.
Well, I've just published last week this new book, Mysticism, Magic and Monasteries.
Oh, how exciting!
With the subheading "Recovering the Sacred Mystery at the Heart of Reality," and this is basically my little contribution to the whole re-enchantment debate that's going on. So that might help. Who knows?
Oh, well, let's read that and then come back and talk with you more advanced position than we're probably in today.
Would you be happy to have a conversation about their book? It sounds very important. It'd be very exciting. Let's read it.
Whatever you like, whenever you like. Yeah.
Good.
And if not here, down the pub.
Yeah, sounds good.
Sounds like that's where it's happening.
Both and.
Both and.
I'm still chastened by the fact that I'm clearly an example of the Catholic who's taken refuge on the internet, but nonetheless,
we're all in that. We're all stuck in that, I'm afraid.
Only in order to redeem it rather than to perpetrate it.
That's what we tell ourselves, Gav.
Perpetuate it.
That's what we tell ourselves.
I mean, look. I mean, what I always say to people is that the fact is you're not going to be able to organically or tacitly, unquestioningly receive a tradition now, because being enmeshed in modernity means we're all so deracinated that there's no choice. But what you can do is, in that kind of Steinerian way, you can deliberately find sources of tradition and intentionally induct yourself into them, and then you will actually begin to get the intellectual habits of tradition. And the way to do that, I think, is learn an ancient and difficult skill, go to an ancient liturgy every Sunday at least, punctuate your day with prayers, read really old books. Right? If you start doing these, don't dress in tracksuits and trainers. Right? If you can just develop these things, they might be performative to begin with, but actually, as the years pass, that's just who you are, and then you're actually reclaiming your own inheritance, your own birthright, and it becomes you. And then you don't have to be one of these kind of chaotic, traumatized, insulated individuals of modernity. You can stand in a tradition, and you won't get pushed hither and thither by ideological tempests. So that's my general practical approach to life, really.
Yeah,
You heard
I
it
love
here
that.
first.
You heard it here, hopefully not first and hopefully not last, but you did hear it here. I love that, and I'm scanning the room behind me, wondering how many artificial fibres I've got in the room, and look and see Sebastian's tweed jacket behind him and living as he speaks. I think that's actually really good. I've just written an article for the Herald's December edition about cooking with mother, and about how I baked with my mum, and she, as we baked, she talked to me about, you know, the ingredients we were using. She talked about Lent, about being such a difficult time, and then the feasting at Easter, and tying the food that we were baking to the liturgical rhythms, which themselves are in tune with the rhythms of creation. And that, I didn't think all of that was happening at the time, but it fed something in me, and I now bake with my daughter and think just something like that is a tradition that's passed down. I say, this is Granny's cake, and then she will take it to her children, and so on. So in these little ways, as you say,
It's brilliant. They're not little at all. These are huge things.
No, yeah, exactly. But that's really important. And for because I know many people are sort of tearing their hair out with this modern world and saying, what are the answers? And I'm glad that we ended, as we must do now, with some solutions, because we do spend a lot of our time just frantically saying, isn't it all awful? But it doesn't have to be. So yeah, let's take what you said there to finish, and hope that can offer some.
A quick pithy way to put that is use postmodernism to self-author self-author yourself into that one thing that no postmodernist could have ever imagined postmodernism leading to, namely traditionalism.
Very good.
I'm not sure that was as pithy as you'd hoped it would be. But,
potent, pregnant, and paradoxical. Very good.
All right. Jolly good. Well, look, very nice to be with you both. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, no problem. We'll talk again, I hope. I also just want to give a mention to your podcast, which I've caught just recently, called Nostalgia. Is that right? With Brian Scarf?
Yeah, with Brian, Nostalgia with a silent G.
Yes, very good.
Yeah.
The trouble is, the moment you give that away, you fall into a degree of pretentiousness that people laugh at. But quite right.
Well, we'll link.
Never stopped me before.
No, exactly. Don't let it now.
And never will again. Hooray.
We'll link your work below, so people can take a look at the podcast and other things, and look forward to talking with you again about your book, which Gavin will read over Christmas.
If not
then
before.
Tell me all about. I've already got about 4 books that just arrived this week that I've got to try and get my head through, and I'm busy underlining them all. So we'll get to it. But Sebastian, thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to talking again and catching up for that drink.
Many thanks.